everyone. Welcome to the History Valley Podcast with your host, Jacob Berman. Today I am joined by two guests, Dr. Joshua Bowen and Dr. Jim Majors. Dr. Bowen graduated from the Johns Hopkins University in 2017 with a Ph.D. in Assyriology. He wrote his dissertation on the lamentational liturgies of the city of Kish and specializes in the Sumerian language. Joshua was awarded a Deutscher Akademischer Austauschdienst and Fulbright scholarship during the 2014-2015 academic year, allowing him to spend the year in Tubingen, Germany, working with Dr. Konrad Volk on his dissertation project. As well as his PhD, Josh holds a bachelor's in religion from Liberty University, a master of theology in the Old Testament from Capital Bible Seminary, and a master's of arts in Near Eastern studies from the Johns Hopkins University. Prior to entering academia, Joshua was a chaplain in the U.S. Air Force, where he also gained an associate in arts in avionics. As for Dr. Jim Majors, he received his PhD in the state of Oklahoma, and he has a master's in theology on New Testament studies, and he has written a dissertation on the book of Daniel. Both of these guests join me today to discuss Old Testament parallels to Mesopotamian literature and the Babylonian captivity and how it affected Judaism and influenced ancient Israel.
I'll also be leaving a link in the description to Digital Hammurabi, which is Dr. Joshua Bowen's YouTube channel. He also published two books available on Amazon, one called Did the Old Testament Endure Slavery? And the other called The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Volume 1. I will leave links to both of them in the description below. And I will also be doing the same for Dr. Jim Majors' YouTube channel, Jim Majors. Please check them out and subscribe to their channels.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the History Valley Podcast with your host, Jacob Berman. Today, I am joined by Dr. Joshua Bowen and Jim Majors. And today, we're going to be discussing the Babylonian captivity, influences into Judaism in that time period in the 6th century BCE, which was a very intense time for the Jews in that time period. They just got liberated by Cyrus the Great by about 538 BCE. That's when he released them, and they declared him in the book of Isaiah to be the Messiah. Now that actually takes me to my first question. What are the thoughts? What do both of you think about Cyrus being declared to be the Messiah, an agent of God on earth, even though he is a foreigner? Why do both of you think that they viewed him that way, even though he was a foreigner?
So I think it works to the narrative, because comparatively speaking, when you look at the other rulers that they were that they had to live under, especially in the diaspora, the Persians were by far the most lenient. The period under Persian rule was a breeze compared to that under the Babylonians or the Assyrians or the Egyptians, and so they were allowed to, return and to rebuild the temple and to practice their religion in ways that they were not so free to do under people like Nebuchadnezzar.
And I mean, I think the overall theological position that, the Hebrew Bible takes in a bunch of different places is that God controls the nations, right? And controls the rulers of those nations. So, the idea that he would bring someone to power is certainly, a foreigner to power that would work for the good of his peoples. Certainly, there's nothing foreign about that. I guess in the various prophets, parts of the writing. So,
yeah, you see something similar in the New Testament, like with King Herod, or with Quirinius calling a tax on the nation. It's like, well, look, he's using these Gentiles to further his kingdom.
It also reminds me of Josephus and what he said about Vespasian, and his works. All right, so that takes me to my next question. This relates to the book of Deuteronomy. something I've been fascinated about for a while is and I know there's been a lot of scholarship on this. Deuteronomy chapter 42, verses 8 to 9. Yahweh inherits Israel from a higher God, and this has something to do with El and his 70 sons in the Canaanite pantheon, in which Judaism appears to have major roots in. They seem to have borrowed a lot of their ideas from that religion. Baal was a Canaanite god. Many say Yahweh started out as a Canaanite god, or a volcano, storm god, maybe a mixture of both. Is the concept of the nations, because he divided the nations, gave each nation their own god, apparently. That's what it says in the Dead Sea Scroll version of Deuteronomy, that the sons of God receive the nations. It doesn't say according to the number of Israel. That was the Masoretic version. Did it appear to be that the earliest Jews were heavily polytheistic based on this?
I wouldn't say polytheistic. They were definitely they're definitely monolatrous. Like they definitely acknowledge the existence of other gods. And so I think this was a way of explaining why these neighboring nations were worshiping these foreign gods with such fervor.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we have to ask the question, are we talking about religion as presented in the Hebrew Bible, or are we talking about like early Israelite religion? Because I think those things can be very distinct.
Right.
So if we're talking about, this people group that in the, the early Iron Age starts to emerge from, their Canaanite surroundings because they finally have some freedom under the, from under the hand of the Egyptians.
Right.
Their worship, surprise, surprise, is going to look a lot like, Canaanite worship. So I think, if you look at the Hebrew Bible, in particular that passage in Deuteronomy 32, and again, I think Jim could probably speak to this much more than I could. In fact, I think a lot of the things that we talk about today, Jim's going to be able to speak far more eloquently to them. It's what happens when you get a PhD in that Second Temple period. But
eloquent is a word that I have not been described before.
But I think that if you're looking at early Israelite religion, this is what the prophets, this is what the text of the Hebrew Bible are often reacting against, is this sort of polytheistic worship. So like I'm thinking even of Ezekiel, in Ezekiel following the initial stages of captivity, has this vision where he comes back to the temple, and what does he see going on inside of the temple precinct? You've got essentially Ishtar and Tammuz worship. So I mean, I think we've got to be careful, and Jim, you feel free to steer this another direction if you like. But I think that it's important to recognize the distinction between what these Judean scribes are doing when they put the Hebrew Bible together, and what Israelite religion was like prior to such a period, and even I'd say even during.
I completely agree. But before the exile, there isn't anything that I think that we can call Judaism, or that would be, familiar to us as Judaism. I think that Dr. Josh is right. A distinction does need to be drawn between, this early Yahweh cult and other associated, branches of worship, and what emerged from the exile.
Yeah, it does. It certainly does look that way, especially when I studied the documentary hypothesis. It seems like the earlier form of the Torah, if one were to call it that, in such an earlier form of it, it seems to be leaning, maybe not completely, but leaning towards polytheism. And as it was developing over time, it became more monotheistic. By the Babylonian captivity, that is typically what they the consensus says, from what I know.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the as far as the Pentateuch itself is concerned, I think what you see in earlier sources is, much more, I don't know, leniency, fluidity, um, in the place that God can be worshipped, right? And I think I definitely think there's monolatry during this period. I don't think that the Hebrew Bible is ever advocating. I mean, Jim, correct me if you think I'm wrong on that, but I don't think that it's ever advocating for polytheistic worship. I think, quite to the contrary. But, or earlier source material does seem to indicate that, worship God at this site, worship God at that site, build an altar here, build an altar there. And then when you come into the 7th century, sort of like stereotypical, the idea of Josiah and his reform in the late 7th century and following, now we've got restriction. Like where do you worship? We worship in Jerusalem. Like this is where this worship takes place. And so I think that's an important thing to recognize. And it makes sense, right? Because I think when you think about, the late 8th century, and you've got a lot of Sumerian refugees that are coming down following the destruction of the new Assyrian Empire of Samaria in the north. Now you've got sort of this much more of an intermingling, a mix between the priests that were up in the northern tribes and what's going on in the south. And ultimately, I think you end up with some collision between the different parts of the priesthood. And I think that's to be expected. And if the Judean scribes are the ones putting this together, you're going to see that come out. And again, Jim, doctor, please,
no, I
correct me if you
agree.
think I'm off.
Well, it's important to remember that whenever the with all the Babylonian exiles all said and done, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the population of Jerusalem was brought into exile, and so it still left this lower class of people. Most of them, they went and joined other communities, but some of them stayed in the areas surrounding, and they would continue in the familiar type of worship, a worship that, while was restricted, somewhat like that of the Jews living directly under Babylonian rule, it wasn't as they didn't have as many eyes on them, so they could practice it a little bit freer. So whenever you have all of these Jews returning from the exile, after Cyrus liberates them and tells them that they could come rebuild the city, rebuild the temple, whatever, then like Dr. Josh said, you had this clash with religions, and they've experienced clash before, but this is a clash that was a little bit different because they were just similar enough that these clashes made a difference. They both honored the law of Moses. They both had somewhat of a similar set of laws, maybe as far like Deuteronomist, but they believed in Yahweh, and by this time I think a greater idea of monotheism, or the desire for monotheism, that definitely pushing towards that direction was rising up in both of them. But other than that, they had some severe doctrinal differences. One main one being, where do we worship? Do we worship in Jerusalem, or do we worship in these high places?
Yeah, I remember when I was looking at it, it definitely looked that way. I agree completely. That actually takes me to the next thing, because we kind of touched on the exiling, and when it came to the composition, the Sumerian refugees, and that made me think about Moses for a moment there, and I want to ask both of you, what are the thoughts? What are you guys' thoughts on the story of Manifu, and Manifu telling us about this Osarsiv, And Osiris apparently changes his name to Moses around the time that Moses is supposed to have lived, and he seems to rebel against the Egyptians and these Egyptians. It seems to be legendary, and there's no confirmation of this that I can see.
If I remember correctly, he recruited like a leper army. Is it
Right.
the same guy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
there might be like a core of historical truth to it, but even if there was, it's nowhere near what the Exodus claims to be.
right.
As far as, you know, the Exodus, the Jewish Exodus, or Israelite Exodus, rather. You don't have the numbers.
Yeah.
You don't have the culture. You don't have the similar classification of people. It's just completely different.
All right. Now that takes me to the next part of that question. There are a lot of authors out there that compare the Hyksos Exodus to the Book of Exodus, and some authors I've noticed that they've exaggerated the parallels. Some even outright claim that the Jews are actually descendants of the Hyksos themselves. This is based on Josephus and against Apion apparently making that claim that the Hyksos are the forefathers of the Jews. I definitely want to get the thoughts of both of you on this. Do any of you believe that pieces of the Hyksos story loosely inspired certain details in the Book of Exodus?
I don't think so. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe the fact that you have these Semitic peoples who are being elevated to, you know, levels of royalty or priesthood, or, you know, some higher echelon of society. But other than that, I don't think there's any real evidence of like direct inspiration. Maybe not even of that. That's the only real similarity that I see that's plausible, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, of course, there are lots of different opinions, right, on the Exodus,
right,
among scholars that are, you know, experts in that aspect of the field. And so, like, one of the things that seems to be a consensus view is that there's probably something or some things behind the memory of the traditions of the Exodus early on, particularly as you see them in like the 8th century. The problem is that people hear that, particularly like Christian apologists will hear that, and they will say, aha, everybody thinks it's historical. And I've had people say that to me. Look, consensus scholarship says that it's historical. And it's like, right. We have to make sure we define what we mean by that. So, like, there are a couple of things that everybody agrees on. Lots of things, actually, that everybody agrees on. You have people coming from Canaan throughout the second millennium, be they as, you know, part of this ruling class or Canaanite slaves. You know, you have them throughout the second millennium. You have this movement, which is totally expected. Because again, that's that narrow strip of the southern Levant it's where you got to go through it to get down to Egypt. So, you know, following this Hyksos period where these foreign rulers are in charge, Egypt tightens its borders, right? And so then we start to get a little more information, or at least we have some information about, you know, apparently Canaanite slaves that are escaping. There's 2 of them, right? You know, but they seem to take a similar path out of Egypt during the 13th century. You know, we have border records, you know, even if they're part of scribal exercises, you know, it seems like there's some verisimilitude to it that, you know, we have shepherds, Bedouin bringing their flocks in to water them. So at any rate, there's movement between these 2 regions. So there's verisimilitude to the story. Like there's this historical background. But the problem is that there's an edited volume, and I can't remember the 3 authors that edited it together off the top of my head, and that's terrible. but it's like a 2018 publication. But they say, they have this long list of things. Were there Semitic slaves in Egypt? Yes. Do we have those slaves exiting Egypt in like a runaway? Yes. Do we have moving? Yes. You get this whole list of yes, yes, yes. But at the end, it's like, but does that mean that 2.5 million, 3 million people walked out of Egypt, in the 15th century? No. Right? So and that's the key.
They were all like individual events. I think that's important distinction to make too, is that these weren't all just part of one event. They were individual events themselves.
Over like a 500-year period.
Right, so right. And it was like as a cycle, for a good bit of it.
So, and this has become, and I stop me if I'm going into the droning on mode, but this is one of the things that has caused, probably some of the more significant things that has caused evangelical scholars to have to move these dates down, right? Because 15th century, that's where it was, right? Because that's what the biblical text seems to say. Well, that's not possible, right? It's not tenable anymore. So, all right, well, we got, maybe we can play with those dates and bump them down a little bit to where it seems like maybe it is more possible. But you still run into this huge problem of the numbers. And so then you have to sort of rethink, well, maybe it doesn't mean 600,000 fighting men. Maybe it means like 600 military units. But then you have the problem of the censuses. You have the problem of the fact that Israel is considered to be this massive horde that licks up the land, outside of Canaan. So at any rate, I think that there's a difference between people having either like a cultural memory or just a general memory of either enslavement in Egypt and on a very small scale, or even, probably to me more likely, enslavement in the land of Canaan itself, because down into the 12th century, Egypt has this pretty firm hold on Canaan. And it's, so, having this memory of, oh my gosh, now the Egyptians are gone and we're free and now we can do it, like that can develop, I think, pretty quickly into, a deliverance from slavery sort of event. And again, last thing I'll say, the fact that like Stephen Russell in 2009 wrote this monograph talking about the different traditions, and he cites 3 different traditions that show up in the Hebrew Bible about the Exodus, and they have some overlap, but they're also distinct from one another, and that's interesting because there isn't even it doesn't appear that there's actually a unified Exodus tradition coming down into like the 8th century prophets.
Yeah, I made an analogy in a paper that I wrote 2 years ago that people seem to like, so I'll share it since it's relevant. But
brag.
The Exodus, the historical Exodus is compared to the story of the Exodus is kind of like saying, okay, Cyrus liberated the Israelites. They were able to go back and they were able to rebuild. Even though we know historically, many of them didn't. In fact, initially, most of them didn't. And when they did go back, they went in waves. So it would be like making up the story of the exile from Babylon, where Darius the Mede leads 1 million Israelites through the land of Canaan and back into Israel. It would be really weird and awkward to try to make it fit historically, but it's the same kind of like, grandizing kind of literary design that you would expect to see in a nation that's really just trying to establish their origins.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because I know that there are scholars out there that say that what could be called the historical Exodus, if one were to call it that, was a much smaller Exodus than the exaggerated one described in the book of Exodus. And it happened much later than it was supposed to, under not quite the same circumstances as presented in the book of Exodus.
Yeah. It's like Exoduses, but with a little e.
Right. Now, this text I've been curious about for a while. The Ludlow Bell Nemica, the poem of the righteous sufferer. Many call that story like basically the Babylonian Job. Apparently narrated by a Subsi Mazrasakan, and it's about this guy that apparently is punished by the gods. He's innocent. He's getting punished, and some say that this character could have inspired the narrative in Job. Well, what are the thoughts of both of you on this?
You want me to start off on this
take that one, Dr. Josh, since
Okay.
It's an Assyrian text.
Yeah, so I mean, I haven't read through Little Baal Namaki in a while. But yeah, so we did a video on this on our channel where we read through the text and then sort of did some loose commentary on it and to show the comparisons. So yeah, I mean, you're talking about a guy that is wrestling with what you see, in a very similar fashion to what Job is wrestling with, and why am I suffering? Right? I'm a pious guy. I'm serving Marduk. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. And why is it that I'm suffering? And ultimately finds deliverance, if I'm remembering the end of the text. So the question of intertextuality between sources is actually it can be tough to nail down. And so, I haven't looked into the intertextuality between Little Baal Namaki and Job, which I think would take a little bit of doing. And certainly people have done it. I just have to read through the secondary literature and see what I think about it. But some of the guiding principles to that are we just talking about a theme that we see in ancient Near Eastern literature, where you have somebody who suffers unjustly? And we do, like that poem is not the only place that we see that sort of thing and that sort of rationale. It does seem like there's this question: is it futile to worship the gods? Because it seems like bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. And of course, in the Hebrew Bible, you see a similar thing, right? The book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, that's also, in a way, the message. Yeah, that's right. Do you know anything about Daniel, Dr. Jim? I'm not sure. I think you've done some work on it.
I know that he was writing in like the 9th century BCE. Is that right?
Something like that, roughly, I think.
under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah, I know a little bit about Daniel.
But that sort of intertextuality and reliance, there are some places, both in the Hebrew Bible and in other ancient Near Eastern texts, where the connections are very clear. So you have things like blind motifs, where you have text A, the earlier text, and then text B, where you think that text B is borrowed from, for lack of a better term, text A. How do you determine that? Well, there's a really good edited volume that just came out like 4 years ago in 2017 by Zioni Zavit, I think is I think he's the one that edited it. But David Carr has a great article in that talking about, like, how do you do that? What's the methodology that you utilize? And one of the things that you can look for is something like a blind motif. So if you see something in text B that is quoting from or utilizing almost directly from text A, but doesn't make sense in the setting of text B. And I'll give a what I think is a good example, a clear example of this. I talk about this a lot in the Anzu myth. where you have older Akkadian text that talks about Ninorta. Ninorta defeats a bird, the Anzu bird, and the text says, "Let the feathers of Anzu blow through the wind back to the gods to declare your victory over the Anzu bird." So the feathers blow in the wind. Well, that makes sense, right? Well, the Enuma Elish, later text B, very clearly in a bunch of different places and in a lot of different ways utilizes the Anzu myth. And one of the blind motifs that you see in there is the text says, "Let the blood of Tiamat blow through the wind back to the gods." Well, blood doesn't, I mean, you can see the obvious connection between those two, but blood doesn't really blow through the wind, right? And I guess they can a little bit, but certainly not like feathers. So they're pulling something into text B that doesn't actually fit very well, but they're doing it to make that connection. So they call that a blind motif. And that's actually that could be a really clear way to show intertextuality between those. So I'd have to spend some time translating through Job, translating through the Lobel Namaki again, and then reading the secondary literature on it and seeing what people have said about it.
One thing that I can say about it is that I found really interesting is so in Daniel you have this motif of the lion's den where Daniel is thrown for one of two reasons, depending on if you're reading, the later Greek Apocrypha or if you're reading the Book of Daniel itself. But when we look through Persian literature, we look through Babylonian literature, through all these court texts, we don't see any case of a den of lions being used. But whenever we get into this, what I would call, more wisdom literature, then we find a single source that mentions the den of lions, and it's pretty much neck and neck with Daniel, except whereas Daniel's using it as a punishment, the little Beldamiki is using it as a metaphor of being a foreigner in the court. Being a member of the court as a foreigner, and how difficult and how brutal and vicious and bitchy, I guess you could say, that the different these different court officials would be in order to get each other bumped off so they could gain a rung or whatever. So it wasn't a physical lion's den, but it's kind of like what we would call in boot camp the shark tank, when you'd be in a room alone with a bunch of RDCs.
That's that makes me think of this other question that I have. I'll ask you first, Dr. Jim. What do you think about the based on the importing of foreign ideas into the Old Testament and in the way it's being done? Does it seem like that during the captivities, the Jews re-engineered foreign heroes to create their own characters, like Moses, like borrowing from Sargon of Akkad's birth narrative, or maybe even attributing different stories to him that have things to do with other people's little exoduses, and turn them into a sort of a composite figure?
Oh, sure. I think that whenever it was probably a good idea that whenever they had the opportunity that they would insert familiar ideas that their children would have grown up with, they would have grown up with in captivity or under foreign influence, because it really helps smooth the seams out, so to speak, as far as a transitioning or trying to establish some sort of unification in your beliefs and traditions. So like for example, like Sargon of Akkad, he was placed in a river. It was placed in the reeds with a basket that was coated in bitumen, and he was pulled out of the water. You have that whole motif. I think that was beneficial because one, you don't want to give credit to the other guys, right? So you're not going to use the same name. You're going to make it different enough to where it's clear that he's a different pitcher. And if you can, you're going to make it to where he's a superior figure, whether he's more righteous or he's stronger or lives longer, whatever the case may be. It's kind of like being in the lion's den. These competing mythologies is that they're always trying to step on each other's neck to try to be the highest guy on the totem pole.
Cool, that makes sense. It's like I feel like they did that a lot, creating multiple characters, and even Abraham, from borrowing from Mesopotamian stories like that. And Abraham had his own little
I don't want to make it seem like there's like just an extravagant amount of this happening, but there is a sufficient amount of it happening that it's clear that you can say, yeah, it's clear that there is some borrowing going on here, some influence, whether doctrinally or in the narratives themselves. But people can take this whole this parallelomania a little too far, and they do.
Yeah,
but I mean, I think one of the things that we've got to make sure that we recognize, I feel like I say that a lot, is that it's not just the Hebrew Bible that does this. I was just talking about the Anzu and myth and Enuma Elish.
Right.
The connection between those are two Akkadian texts, right? They're coming from essentially the same cultures, generally speaking. But the reason, like Jim was talking about, when you bring something into your story, into your mythology, you make your guy, your divine being better, stronger, faster, whatever. Well, in that particular case, and again, it's an Akkadian text utilizing an older Akkadian text. In that story, I mean, it's clear, like there's no question about this, that, the story of Enuma Elish is about Marduk and his ascendancy over the other gods. Well, Marduk is, without question, a revivified Ninurta, and Ninurta is the hero of the Anzu myth. And you can see the connections, but the big thing that they're trying to do in that text is to show how much more powerful and how much braver and how much, more cunning, or all these things, Marduk is, even over Ninurta, whom, they would have thought was an amazingly powerful deity. And you can see that in the text. And one example that I always give is in the Anzu myth, the older one, the Anzu bird holds the Tablet of Destinies, and the Tablet of Destinies is like the reality stone in the Avengers movies, right? And so whatever he wants to do in reality,
that's great.
He says it and it happens, right? And so Ninurta, in the early story, like has to fight and fight and fight and fight, and then he tries to shoot him with an arrow, the Anzu bird with an arrow, and he holds up the Tablet of Destinies and says, "Arrow, go back to your thicket," right? So the arrow, because he controls reality, the arrow, because it's made of wood, turns around and flies back to the thicket. And ultimately, Ninurta has to trick the Anzu bird in order to defeat him. He doesn't defeat him through his own power. He has to take the advice of another god, Ea, in order to defeat him through trickery. Well, when you get later to Marduk, Marduk ends up fighting Kingu. He goes up against Kingu, who's holding the Tablet of Destinies, and there is no fight. Marduk just approaches, and Kingu's down. So, I mean, for people that knew the text, which I think would have been pretty common for people to recognize this interplay, they would have thought, my God, Ninurta had to struggle, and then ultimately win through trickery. Marduk is so strong that he just approaches, and Kingu, the guy that holds that same Tablet of Destinies, down, defeated.
So basically,
Um,
just walking towards them, and just by his mere presence
yeah,
of walking
that's
towards
right.
them, he just
and
goes straight
and
down.
then they create humans from his blood.
Yeah, I remember
Yeah.
that.
So if you think about that with respect to something like Genesis 1, which is utilizing Enume Elish,
Right.
and you think about what is I mean, you can see the connections, we could talk about those, but what is it that's different about Genesis 1? And the thing that's different about Genesis 1 is how powerful Yahweh is, right? Or how powerful Elohim is.
Right.
Just speaking the word, right? And you think about the allusions to Tiamat, be it in a subtle way with the word Tehom for the deep, or with the fact that you have the Taninim, these dragons that seem to be a blind motif in and of themselves. It's all demythologized, right? They're not, you don't fight them. God, Elohim doesn't fight them. They're just his playthings, right? Things that are just
Submit.
yeah, like so here, as Jim's talking about, like, now your God is even more powerful than somebody like Marduk. So I think those are important things to recognize.
Yeah, and the more powerful he is, they're trying to establish this monotheistic God, so he necessarily has to take on these things that other polytheistic gods are accredited for. So you had a goddess of fertility. Well, not anymore. That's Elohim. You had the goddess of the storms. Oh, that's Elohim. That's this God. That's this God. It's he does everything. He's responsible for all, and along with that, came, I think, a necessary or near necessary adoption of this dualistic mindset, of good versus evil. Because if God is all powerful and he's this monotheistic God, well, then that means he created evil too. That means there's no more bad gods to blame it on. So we've got to figure something out.
Right. Like it says in Isaiah, the God character who creates both good and evil, and he's the Lord. So
Yeah, it's not the same kind of evil there, but
right.
but yeah.
So what do you both think about this text called the Book of Daniel? Well, not the Book of Daniel. I mean, the Tale of. Let me see.
Tale of Eckhart?
The Tale of Eckhart. Yeah, it talks about this character called Daniel. He's a Canaanite, and there are some that think he is the inspiration for the. Some authors compare him to Daniel. I guess thinking that he's.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Because I mean, Ezekiel, when Ezekiel's writing, I mean, the Daniel that's purporting to be writing, it would be a contemporary with Ezekiel, right? And so Daniel would be like probably 20 or younger, when Ezekiel's writing this, and he's comparing him to Noah and Moses, and saying that he's this wise guy, this great, this righteous guy. But at this point, Daniel hadn't even done anything yet.
Right.
So I mean, there's that difficulty, and then you have the additional difficulties of it talks about them having sons and daughters, which we don't know that Daniel had. It's possible that Daniel was a eunuch, but yeah.
All right.
So sorry, Dr. Josh.
No, that's definitely your area.
So this is my next question. I'm going to ask to both of you. I want to ask Dr. Josh first, and then you, Dr. Jem, see what you think about next. What do you? So Dr. Josh, what do you think about Genesis 1? So Elohim shows up. Elohim shows up in the story, and then in Genesis 2, Yahweh shows up in the story. Yahweh Elohim, and so the Most High goes to sleep on the Sabbath, apparently. And then Yahweh shows up in the story all of a sudden, and he creates this garden, creates Adam and Eve, puts him in there. And to me, somewhat reminds me of Deuteronomy when he inherits Israel from the Most High. It sounds somewhat similar to me. So I wanted to get the thoughts of both of you on this. What do you guys think about this? Does this seem to be the entrance of the monolatry idea that, okay, so here comes Yahweh. This is how he comes in the story, and here he is. And this is a mythological explanation of how he becomes the national God of Israel, and over time he becomes this super powerful monotheistic version of the same God, and then they combine the two into the same God in order to eliminate the apparent multi-godness of the text.
I've never thought about it from that perspective. I doubt it. I think what's going on here is you've got two different stories from two different sources. So, when you look at, what's going on in the P source in Genesis 1, Elohim is, again, I think, being compared and contrasted with, in particular, Marduk in the Enuma Elish. And so when you see things like, he rests, I think that's, I don't know what I'd call it, an illusion. I'm an echo, a play off of, in some way, of, Babylon being created as a place that the gods can rest and be refreshed. But that idea, I think, you see that sort of thing throughout Genesis 1. And actually a really good book on this was just published. David Carr wrote it, and it's called, it might be like the background to Genesis 1 through 11. I thought I actually had it in here.
The background of the primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11.
There you go. And so I think what we're looking at there is the P story, right? So then when you get into Genesis 2, now we're in J, or non-P, whatever whatever people want to say.
To P or not to P.
That's right. And so this is now we've got a story that it's not that it's a different deity. I don't think. I just think this is a different tradition that's come down, probably an older tradition. And I'd say that's probably the consensus position. And the deity here is just portrayed differently, right? So he's more anthropomorphized. He walks around in the garden. He makes mistakes, right? He tries things out. They don't work. And I think there's a real possibility that, again, it's not my area of specialization, so nobody should quote me on this, but I think I tend to think that Genesis 1 probably is a reaction to or development of the story in Genesis. Did I say Genesis 1? The story in Genesis, the P version, I think, is probably a reaction to development of what we see in the non-P source, J source in chapter 2, to try to set God up as more transcendent. But in any case, I think you're looking at two different stories. Now, I think you're, and I'll be quiet, but the insight where it's showing Yahweh to ultimately be the God of Israel, I think that's the point. I think you're spot on. That's the point of the primeval history, right? Because in its entirety, in its final form, you just watch it, right? And people make a big deal out of this sort of stuff, but I think they maybe don't recognize what's going on in the text from a literary standpoint. God creates and man screws up, right? So then God ultimately, like Genesis 6, man screws up so badly that God has to start over again. So he starts essentially from a Genesis 1 scratch, right? And begins with Noah. And in Noah, immediately, even having been rescued and delivered completely by God's grace, immediately starts screwing up, right? Goes out and creates this vineyard, gets drunk, right? And ultimately, then you see this sort of descent where we end up at the Tower of Babel, and now they're doing exactly the opposite of what they're supposed to be doing. And so God has tried several different times to work with the nations, as they're being described here in the primeval history. And they fail. And so then God, starting at the end of chapter 11, definitely in the beginning of chapter 12, calls out his nation, the nation of Israel, through Abraham. And so I think that's exactly what's going on. That's the way the text is structured literarily.
Dr. Jim?
I mean, yeah, I agree with everything that Dr. Josh said. I would say ditto if I could get away with it. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of merit to the idea, you know, that you have this Yahweh source and you have this priestly source, and they are competing traditions from at least two groups of people that both hold it authoritative in its own right, and it's essentially the job of this redactor / author to smooth out the bumps, you know, to make this as seamless as possible. But I think I want to be Dr. Josh here for a second. You know, I have to warn against, you know, interpreting it through a modern lens. And when I say that, I mean looking at it and saying, oh yeah, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and there are these contradictions. It's like, well, yes, there are contradictions. I'm not saying that there's not, but through a modern lens, it's an issue. Through an ancient lens, through the lens of the redactor and the audience of both respective texts, it wasn't an issue. We see the same contradictions in the different creation narratives in Assyrian text and Mesopotamian text in general, but it was never an issue. You know, that they would take a little bit of this one, take a little bit of this one, whatever they need to do to get to their eventual goal. You know, like whether it's, you know, putting Marduk at the head of the pantheon. You know, well, we have to have him, you know, kill Tiamat, and we have to have him do this, and it was just never an issue in ancient eyes to have these competing traditions. It's very much a modern thing. So, but when people go to try to reconcile it, I think that's one of the most silliest things, you know, when they can't just say, yes, there's contradictions. So what? They go through such extreme measures to make it not a contradiction that they end up just bastardizing any remnant of authorial intent that's left.
Yeah, I mean, if you think, just as a sort of a modern example of this, if you guys watch The Office, Pam, who is a painter or a drawer, I can't remember. A drawer, is that a thing? Anyway, she's an artist.
Yeah.
Well, she draws this picture or paints this picture of the office, and Dwight comes up and says, well, look, there's shadows going in two directions here. Right? What are there, three suns? This isn't the Andromeda galaxy or something, right? And while that's funny, if you were to then, like, if we came to that painting and we said, yeah, okay, so she wasn't thinking this one all the way through. She got a shadow going this way and she got another shadow going this way. Doesn't really work. If an apologist came up to that, quite often what they would say is, well, actually, the way that this painting is designed is that, you know, it's trying to depict movement throughout time. And so actually, you know, it's
chronological.
And that's the way that it's trying to, so it's trying to show through the shadow how it's developing over time. It's like, no, she just drew two shadows. Like, it's okay. Just
but Dr. Josh, it's a foreshadowing.
Brilliant. Somebody's got to clip that. But no, I think that's
I'll clip it and have it on
analogy.
separate video.
Make it a GIF.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, I think that trying to come to that and to harmonize it is to just miss it, right? It's more important to say, yeah, she messed that up. Let's look at the beauty, the beauty, as Ken Tobin might say, the beauty of the picture, right? And to say, look, let's look at it as it stands. Don't worry about the fact that there's an extra shadow over here. Yeah, she screwed up. It's fine. But look how beautiful this is and what she's trying to say through it. That's what we need to be doing.
Right.
Don't focus in on, oh, we've got the out of order here, the animals being created after humans. So actually what this probably is like a new separate creation of animals. Look, just miss me with that shit, right? just appreciate what's going on in the literature itself.
Yeah, it's kind of like dunking on your second grader for drawing you bigger than the house.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. So, doctors, Joshua and Jim, what do you guys think about the parallels of Enman Duranka, or some call him Enman Durana, with Enoch? Some compare him to Enoch because he was taken to heaven by the gods Shamash and Adad.
I haven't done near enough studies on the Assyrian side of this to really comment. I do see some parallels, but whether one is the cause of the other, I can't really speak to that.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't venture into it too far either. Seth Sanders wrote a book From Adapa to Enoch, and it's not an easy read. It's a tremendous read, but it's not easy to get through. But we brought him on our channel and interviewed him specifically about this whole progression. So, like, just so everybody listening knows what we're talking about, just so they have a general background, because I won't be able to provide a lot here. There is this idea of the heavenly trip, right? And how does this motif or theme, I always mix those up, play out when you see it in Mesopotamian traditions and when you see it in the Hebrew Bible? And is there a connection there? Is there a development? So you have somebody like Adapa, and Adapa is Enki or Ea's
Creation.
Yeah, but he's like a priest that is very supportive, and probably brings offerings to him, almost certainly brings offerings to him. And in the
third
Adapa
highest in the
story,
kingdom.
and in the story Adapa and the South Wind, you have Adapa, he's out fishing probably to catch fish for Enki to offer to him. And the South Wind blows his boat over. And Adapa is skilled in the magical arts, right? So when he comes back up, he curses the South Wind and breaks its wing. And so the South Wind stops blowing. This is a really big deal. It's really, really bad for the land. The gods catch wind of it. So one of the head deities calls for Adapa to come up to heaven. So Ea, Enki, comes up to him and says, look, when you get up there, beware, they're going to offer you this food and drink, and it's poisonous, so don't drink it. So when he gets up there, On offers him food and drink, and it's actually food and drink of eternal life, of immortality. But because Ea has told him don't drink it, he doesn't drink it. And there's all kinds of debate about this, but it's this heavenly trip idea. He's brought up to heaven. And you see the same sort of thing. Now, when you look at where certain figures appear, I think Enmedarana is like seventh. And when you see Enoch, he's seventh in this list. And so anyway, there's trying to drive these comparisons. I think that what Seth Sanders says in his book is that, be wary of those sorts of things. Just because somebody's seventh in a list and there seems to be some connection,
Right.
Don't go assuming that connection or coming to that conclusion without a lot more detail. He kind of says there's a bit of parallelomania going on there. But definitely read Seth's book. It's and watch that interview, because I think he addresses it really well.
This is all that right there you just said is the reason why I'm asking these questions, because I know A doesn't always necessarily mean B, and there's a lot of that going on, and that just gets me to this next question I'm itching to ask both of you. There's a lot of people out there, as I'm sure both of you know about this, that follow the works of Zecharia Sitchin, and it's just nothing that he basically claims can about the cuneiform text can be found in the cuneiform text, and there's these extreme exaggerations. I don't. So let me ask you both this: do you both feel? Because when I read his books, I think to myself, I feel like, is he taking what the Old Testament says, and then he's kind of novelizing it by combining it with Mesopotamian text and then calls it a translation. Like that's
I don't know if he does that, but he makes a lot of unjustified leaps in logic.
right.
Like he doesn't know Sumerian. That like I feel comfortable saying that. If he does know Sumerian, or if he did know Sumerian, he's passed now, but if he did know Sumerian, he hid it very well in his writing. So
he didn't want anybody to know.
Yeah, like because I'm actually teaching through Sumerian on the Atheist Network Group's channel now on Sunday evenings. And we just talked about the verbal chain in Sumerian. And one of the things you see is that the verbal chain is made up of different syllables in cuneiform, but they're all trying to represent a single word. So a good example of this that I give is if I were to write out my name phonetically so that somebody could pronounce it out loud without knowing, how to pronounce it just by reading how it's spelled, I would write JAH-SHOE-WAH, Joshua, right? Well, if I did that, and then you came along and said, SHOE, interesting. So Joshua, JAH, that's like a shortened form of Yahweh. And of course, Wa on the end is very close to Yahweh. So in the middle is the word Shu. So therefore, Yahweh has something to do with footwear. And so like Joshua means like the footwear of the gods.
Nike. Joshua is Nike.
Joshua is Nike. Right? And then that's beautiful. Like, and then you draw that connection and you go, oh my God, like, please stop talking. Right. That's what I would want to say.
I love that.
No more talking.
Yeah.
But that's
what apologists do all the time.
Yeah.
So the word Bandu, for example, would be made up of three signs: ba, an, and do, three. And Bandu is a verb in and of itself, like to be built. But the way they wrote it is they took the sign ba and put it next to the sign an, put it next to the sign do, to make the sound Bandu. Pretty straightforward. However, in cuneiform, an by itself can mean sky, and do by itself means to build. Right. So, okay. Zecharia Sitchin comes up to this and would say something like, okay, so like the building of the sky. So this is like the formation of, this is like the rakia in Genesis 1. It's actually when we see this verb, it's referring to the structuring of the heavens and the stretching it out as we see in Isaiah. And it's like, whoa. Like the word sky isn't in there. It's just the sound on, which is what is sky in heaven. I mean, in Sumerian, but it's not being used. It's like shu in Joshua. It's not being used to say a piece of footwear. It's just the sound shu.
Right.
And he does that all the time.
And then he when he was corrected, like he would do something like, oh, so what you're saying is it's like the Tower of Babel?
Yeah, this idea of there being multiple layers of interpretation and like hidden layers of interpretation. Now, the interesting thing about this, if there's anything that we can say positive,
right,
is if you go to something like the Enuma Elish, the text we keep talking about, at the end, the scribes do something really cool with the name Marduk, which in cuneiform is Amar Utu. And Amar means calf, and Utu means sun, or the sun deity. And so you can do lots of different word plays with the Sumerian, those two signs together. And that's what they do. So you have this list of the 50 names of Marduk. And what they're doing is they're working with these two cuneiform signs and what they made in Sumerian and what the different values that they have in Akkadian, and they're rearranging them and playing them, making wordplay off, and forming these 50 different names. Okay, so that sort of thing is definitely something that was done in scribal culture, and it was this sort of esoteric, the meaning behind the meaning behind the meaning. There's no question that they did that, but I think when you come to somebody like Sitchin, he never seems to address the first layer, like what it actually meant, right? He just dives into what he thinks these things mean. And what I see is very problematic is that, as with the scribes and the 50 names of Marduk, you can do whatever you want with it. And that's what they're doing. And so when it means anything, to me, it means nothing, right? It stops meaning things, or at least you have to recognize the system and say, okay, did Amarutu really mean all of those things in the beginning? No, right? It's just, this is a building of scribal culture, this elitist scribal culture that starts to make all this play on words for their own purposes. And so it can be imbued with that meaning later, but to read it back into like original intent or something like that, I think is incredibly problematic.
Right. And we see a lot of cases where these scribal puns or plays on words where they actually become popularized, and we see them repeated throughout the literature.
And showing up in commentaries, because you have commentaries, ancient commentaries on these texts, lots of them on the Enuma Elish.
Right. But there's a difference between drawing a parallel between, a familiar phrase or a familiar pun, something that appears, regularly in literature, and then just asserting your own modern interpretation of it, based on, whether it's, the phonology or the morphology or the phonetics of the text, whatever the case may be. There's a big difference between the two.
I think when you like a safe, last thing I'll say, like a safe place to, like a rule of thumb, if you start seeing lasers and rockets in the text, like you're probably going the wrong way.
Or you're reading Revelation.
Right. Right. Yeah, the same thing. If you're reading Revelation and you see helicopters, like, go and talk to Obama. There was a beautiful video that came out in, like, I guess it would have been the mid 2000s, late 2000s. I guess it would have been like 2007, early 2008, where it was this really serious YouTube video that was talking about the name Barack Obama and how it means, actually, it's like a play. I mean, it's actually the translation of, lightning from heaven, which is, of course, what Satan was, right? And so I saw Satan as Barack Obama is how it ended up being. And so it was like Isaiah 14, I think is where it's at. And it's like,
and on this Barack,
I will destroy the church. No, sorry.
The Barack came loose from the mountain, destroyed the statue.
It's so true.
And every time it's if it doesn't happen with that president, it's the next one, and they cook up a similar story.
Of course.
Well, yeah, that's the nature of apocalyptic literature.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Doesn't happen. It happens next time.
Yep.
And repeat.
Yeah, and even if it did happen, it can still be reinterpreted to fit future narratives.
Of course.
A near interpretation and a far interpretation, Jim.
Yeah. Even an ancient near far interpretation. I mean, ancient Near East.
Hey, both work. Yeah.
One of the books that Zecharia Sitchin wrote that just puzzles me the most, I think, is the Lost Book of Enki. And just all this stuff in there, like, okay, so Enki created Adamu and Tidi and put them in Eden. I'm like, and I looked it up because I was curious. Like, this was done. I mean, I haven't heard anyone say that this is the case. Doesn't look like it is. And there's no official translation anywhere. And doesn't even tell us where he got it from. I'm like, that's why I suggested earlier. I just wonder is he implementing? If is he rewriting the like when he wrote that? Was he rewriting the Book of Genesis with some sort of novelistic form of cuneiform in there in mind? It's just something I wonder when I read that.
I mean, I definitely, like, when I was putting my presentation together, and we have a presentation on the 12th planet on our channel. I mean, I was trying to do my due diligence and give him the benefit of the doubt as much as possible. And like when he would cite verbal forms in Sumerian, I was actually searching through the various databases that we have to try to find where did he get this verbal form from, and I couldn't find it, right? Because it looks weird. And when he talks about, like, in the ancient Sumerian texts, it talks about, and you're like, whoa. I mean, I don't expect him to say BM, 436927 or something, but I mean, it'd be nice if he did, but
right.
But
or it's a little less vague. It's like, well, what is it talking about? What is the text about? Like,
right.
But yeah, it's just give me something. Give me the title of the of the story that you're quoting from, but you don't get it so often. So, except when he talks about Gilgamesh and the Scorpion Men who are, guarding the rockets and shooting lasers, like then he tells you where that's at, which makes sense, right?
Yeah, if I had rockets, I'd want laser scorpions to protect it too.
No doubt, no doubt.
And that takes me to this next question. On that same topic. When I looked up like occurrences of the Nibiru in the cuneiform, the closest thing there is to it is really a city called Nippur. Am I correct in saying that it's basically a city, and there's no references to a star called that? From what I can tell, there's no references to a celestial body referred to as that in anywhere in the text.
It's been so long since I've looked at it. I think Nibiru is a reference to Jupiter, maybe. I don't remember.
I think I've heard
Nobody should
about
quote
that a
me on
while
that.
back, and somewhere I read that it was somehow a title for Marduk, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look. It's a fairly narrow subsection,
Right.
or subdiscipline in Assyriology.
Mhm.
I remember looking at all of it. But yeah, the city of Nippur is obviously an incredibly important city,
Right.
both from an educational standpoint, but also from like a religious standpoint. But yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head.
If it was any god, I wouldn't think it'd be Marduk. It'd probably be like Nabu, right?
Are you saying that like it? Oh,
Well, I mean, it looks like
similarity?
I mean, if you're talking like an etymological link or whatever, it's
Yeah, that I suppose so. Because that is
but I have no idea.
Yeah.
I don't know any. Well, I don't know much about it. I know that there are references to it being some celestial object, but whether or not they're the ancient sources reflect the same. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like the one thing that I remember, again off the top of my head, and I probably have a couple more minutes. Megan just came in and looked to see where we were at.
Yeah, same here. It's freaking hot in here.
Oh gosh, but that in the cylinder seals that you see, a lot of these depictions, you'll have like these what look like planets going around, and I think what I remember is they're the Pleiades, but they want to make them into like our solar system to show that extra planet, and it just doesn't. I'm not an astronomer by any means, but like it apparently just doesn't line up at all.
Here's this next question that takes me to a question for both of you. When Yahweh slays the dragon, is he taking over the specific role? Could he be possibly taking over the specific role of Marduk, doing the same thing to Tiamat, or Baal slaying Tannin?
I think it's more like it's Yahweh symbolically slaying Tiamat, that it's not so much, Yahweh slaying some other god. It's a kind of a polemic, way of showing his superiority, his might, his where the other gods just aren't a match for him.
Yeah. And it's not your God, it's my God, right?
Right.
I think is what's going on. My dad can beat up the deity that your dad beat up even better, right? Maybe.
Right.
Like
and I only have one dad.
like Yahweh,
right, exactly.
like Yahweh taking over.
You and your weird uncles.
Like Yahweh taking over as the rider of the clouds, and I think it was in Psalms.
That's right.
Like Baal.
Psalm 68, yeah.
Right.
I finally went and looked it up and remembered it. I keep saying Psalm 136 for some reason, and it's not right.
It's all
Daniel
good.
7.
It's all good. It happens.
But Bernard Bato actually back in the mid 90s wrote a book called Slaying the Dragon. And of course, many people have written since then, but Bato is one of these guys that sort of writes on, the mythology and the mythological aspects of the Hebrew Bible and how it develops. And of course, lots of people have picked up the torch. But I think mythology shows up so much more frequently than what people recognize in the Hebrew Bible. And I don't think that that's necessarily like a death knell for anybody's faith. I just think it's something that, it's like the shadow on the painting. You can still appreciate Pam's painting, right? But just don't try to harmonize the shadow. Don't try to say it's something that it's not. You may just have to shift your paradigm to come at those texts.
Yeah, if you're even just a little bit familiar with biblical Hebrew and with ancient Near Eastern mythology, you get to Genesis 1 verse 2, and you're like, boom! Like immediately you're confronted with the deep, with Tehom, and this very familiar idea of the separating of the waters from above and below, and the cleaving in half of Tiamat by Marduk.
Yep. Which Carr argues, I think, pretty convincingly is in itself a blind motif, because we don't, in Enuma Elish, we know what that, that the thing that holds back the water above is made of, right? It's made of her body,
right?
And it's stretched out. Well, in Genesis, you get this rakia, this hammered out plate-like thing, but we're not told what it's made of. And he makes the argument, again, I think convincingly so, that we're not told about it because it doesn't fit quite. I mean, you can't say that it's made of Tiamat's body. So it's sort of like a bringing it in, maybe even demythologizing it. But
I think the floodgates do that when he talks about the floodgates being open, and I think that's an allusion to the wounds in Tiamat from the sword.
Yeah, interesting.
So
but those sorts of things, I think, are, from a literary standpoint, absolutely essential to recognize, believer and unbeliever alike.
Sure, and it makes the text so much more interesting.
It really, really does. You stop worrying about things like, how do we get, worldwide population from 8 people in 40 years?
Was it man or plants?
Yeah, right. It's like, just forget all that stuff. Look at it as a piece of literature and how it's interacting with ancient Near Eastern texts, and appreciate it for what it's doing.
It becomes so much fun. Like just peeling back the layers becomes a journey in itself. It's so good.
Yeah, definitely.
So I know you both have to go. So here's my last question. Okay. The Tower of Babel is often compared to the Etamananka, I hope I pronounced that correctly, temple of the
Ziggurat.
foundation of heaven and earth. Yeah. And Nimrod himself was compared by Yigal Levin in 2002 with Naram Sin, the grandson of Sargon of Akkad. He thinks Nimrod derives from Naram Sin. I know that typically when it comes to understanding these mythological characters, I know scholars typically say, okay, not one story typically is derived entirely from another story. It doesn't happen like that. Could Nimrod possibly be, that's what I'm asking, could Nimrod possibly be a syncretism of both of those ideas and other ideas, perhaps?
I think it's possible that the person's associated, but I think that the name itself kind of lends credence to the idea that it was invented, for this Tower of Babel story and for this this desire to build a tower to heaven to be like God. And Nimrod means something like let us revolt, or let us oppose.
Yeah, Ronald Hindle compares Ninurta to Nimrod as well. Just want to throw that in there. It might be part of that syncretism, because Ninurta is a great hunter god.
That's interesting. I think a lot of it has to do with the authors of the Hebrew Bible trying to rationalize their experiences and the traditions that they learned while in Babylonian exile.
I think if you've ever, this is more for the audience, I think, but if you've ever listened to an Eminem song, what we're doing is trying to figure out all the things that Eminem is referencing in his song without being privy to the popular culture, right?
Or pausing the song.
Yeah, but right. So, if you think about, a very clear example, the one that I always give is Joan Jett's I Love Rock and Roll, when he brings that into his song like 2 albums ago, I think. I love you because you remind me of me. Well, I mean, you can hear the riff, you can hear her voice, it's like, it's very clear that this is a reworking of that particular song. But there are other places where, I'm giving them pounds, I'm upscale now, I guess that means I'm way in the sky. Like there's clear wordplay there, right? Upscale, I'm way in the sky. Well, what's he pulling that from specifically? Well, maybe not anything specifically. These are just sort of sayings that we have. But there are other things, and I'm just trying to think of some lyrics of his where he's clearly pulling from either a story or an amalgamation of a couple of stories, or, you already know who you are, Kelly, right? Because that song is about R. Kelly, and he's making that play. Like, those are things that you could, but the problem is that we're doing it here in a time that we know all of these people and these stories and these things that he's referencing. It's popular culture. 2,000 years from now, people pick up the lyrics to, and you're like, okay, what's he referencing? And they're trying to get familiar with the literature and the stories. And maybe they say, maybe he's pulling this from, it's really hard to do. And sometimes it's not always a one-to-one correspondence. Sometimes it's stuff that's just in the air, quote unquote. But that's what we're trying to do here. And so there are some times I think it's very clear that somebody could listen to his song and say, that's clearly a reference to Joan Jett, and they'd be right. And you can make those very clear connections. Other times it'd be like, well, I guess it could be coming from this. Maybe it's also coming from that. It's hard to tell. So.
And the thing is that it can be enjoyed either way. It could be a diss track, but if you're not aware of the context and this other rapper, you could just be like, oh yeah, that's catchy, but you're not getting the full thing. You can think that you have an appreciation for it, and you might on some level, but what people like Dr. Josh and I try to do in using the diss track as an analogy is we're trying to delineate and separate all the different elements and point to where these are going to help you understand the song. And some people just say, hey, I just want to listen to the song, and that's fine, but just don't tell me that this is what it means.
And the thing is, the last thing I'll say about this is I think of 2 examples, modern examples. So if you watch Clueless, if you don't know that it's pulling from Emma, Jane Austen's Emma, obviously there are many people, probably most people don't know that, right? But they really like the movie Clueless. And in the same way, or in a similar way, if you watch Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? It's supposed to be from the Odyssey, right? But it leads me, like, I watch it and go, have they read the Odyssey? Like, I feel like it's popular notions of the Odyssey, not so much the Odyssey itself. And so here you have maybe an example, just for our purposes. Maybe this is an example where the people that are writing O Brother, Where Art Thou? They think they know the Odyssey, the story of the Odyssey, and they're pulling, but what they're pulling is like sort of popular ideas that might, like sort of God helps those who help themselves. That's a popular
like
idea
Bible
that's in the Bible. Yeah, right. But it,
like the Cyclops, like,
yeah, but it's not in there, right? And so
right.
so there's a lot of complication involved in this. So if you were 1,000 years from now, 2,000 years from now, to watch O Brother, Where Art Thou? And go, oh, okay, this is pulling from the Odyssey, and start to make these connections. Well, maybe they weren't actually there because maybe they didn't know the Odyssey and they're just pulling from popular ideas. So it's not actually right. And that may be the case in some circumstances where they're pulling from traditions that they're actually not completely in line because they're much later with the original story that they're sort of pulling from. So it's very complicated and can be very messy.
It's possible that between now and the future that O Brother, Where Art Thou? Had become such a huge influence on the Homeric text that the modern interpretation and understanding of and even copies of the Odyssey were changed to fit O Brother, Where Art Thou? And so a person in the future, if they don't pull back that layer and investigate just one step further, then they will never, they'll just be that much further away from the original Odyssey.
Yeah, the reinterpretation of something can become the standard form. There's no question about it.
And it happens more than you think.
Yep.
That's fascinating. And I definitely have noticed that in my research on this. There's definitely a lot of that going on. Well, thank you, Dr. Josh and Dr. Jim Majors, for joining me. I certainly enjoyed this discussion. I would like to have both of you back sometime.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. Fun time.
It was my pleasure. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if any of you haven't already done so. Like the video, share it. Check out the links in the description, and I'll see all of you later. Thank you for watching.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.